So I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional custodians of the land on which we are dialing in from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you everyone for joining, and welcome to the webinar today on being savvy, building confidence in using your data to make better decisions. So we'll start with some introductions. Ruth, do you want to start?
Oh, well, welcome everybody. My name is Ruth Knight and I work at the Centre for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Studies at QUT. I've got a long history of working in the nonprofit sector, but my background is actual clinical nursing and community health. And I've just become very, very excited about outcomes and how we measure the impact of what we do, and have come to realise about the importance of good data, because we can't report, we can't make strategic decisions if we don't have really good data. So I've been on a 25-year journey down this route of understanding the importance of what we collect and then how we use that information. So going to share some insights with you today, and thank you, Liz, for inviting me to be part of this. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Ruth. My name's Liz Jones, so I've worked with digital health technology and digital technology more broadly for the last 20 years or so, and most recently I'm now working at GWI, and we basically specialise in data and digital transformation and work across a whole broad spectrum of industries, but I specialise then in the health and the not-for-profit space. So again, hoping to be able to provide some good insights today and some things to take away that hopefully will create value for you moving forwards in your work as well. So moving on to the agenda for today. So some of the things that we'll be covering, we've done our introductions. We'll talk a little bit about the benefits through better use of data, and really just help you to understand how valuable the data that you hold is to your organisation and the things that you can do with it. Ruth will talk more about then measuring outcomes as opposed to outputs, and talk to you through some of the frameworks that she's using there. Then we'll talk through a little bit more about how to maximise the value of the data that you've collected, and how to maximise the value through proper and good data management. Excuse me. We'll talk through some of the common challenges that you may have in sort of harnessing your data and maximising its value, and hopefully some of those will sound familiar. So then we'll talk through some of the challenges and the opportunities there as well, and how to overcome some of those, and give you some tips to help to maximise the value of your data. And then we'll end with a few key takeaways as well, which hopefully if you remember, some of those key things that will help you moving forward. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is really looking at how to use data to increase the impact that you're creating yourself as an organisation and help you to make better evidence-based decisions using that data, but also using that data to better measure the impact of your work. And that's really to help to then demonstrate your value as an organisation to either your staff or your volunteers, or it could be then for your donors or funders or government, wherever you get your funding streams from, or sponsors, commercial sponsors. So we're going to talk through those things. And I'd say if there's one thing to take away from today that's probably the most important thing, is really to understand that the data is one of your most important strategic assets for your organisation. So just hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that as well through the webinar.
Yeah, so I thought we might kick off with a bit of fun here, because talking about data can sometimes be a bit overwhelming, and it seems a bit statistical sometimes. But I like to use analogies, and I just thought we'd have a bit of fun with everybody here today. And I want you to imagine that if your organisation was a car and your data is the fuel, can you write in the chat box so we can see, what is your car and what's your fuel consumption? So have a little think, because I know that you're all from a wide variety of organisations and in different parts of the country. So let's just have a little think. What type of car is your organisation, and what's your fuel consumption if you kind of thought that data was the fuel? Has anybody got some ideas? Is everybody? Oh, okay, great. Amanda. Okay, fantastic. Okay, we've got a bus driving on low quality fuel. Okay. Vivian is driving an electric car next to nil fuel consumption. Rowan's in a Ford Fiesta, going at 100 kilometres an hour sometimes. Okay. Callum says second-hand ute using unleaded 91. Yeah, great. Okay, those are great analogies and very interesting observations. Oh dear, Kerry. Kerry's not even sure she has some fuel. Yeah, so Mel said one of those Jeeps with no roof, but robust, unfortunately driving with very minimal fuel. And Joe said we're in a second-hand Lexus with poor fuel consumption. Yeah, look, you know, thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate that. I asked you that off the cuff and you didn't have long to think about it. But I think that it's a really important analogy when we realise how important data is to our organisations. So my question, the second question there is currently, how much does data influence your driving decisions? So if you're not running on much fuel, or if your fuel is not good quality, how much are you using it to actually help you make strategic decisions, whether that's about your human resources, your service delivery, your communications, your donor engagement, your grant writing opportunities? You know, how much is the data actually influencing what you're thinking and doing in your work day to day? Has anybody got a little bit of a, yeah, so unfortunately, Mel says, unfortunately we aren't, which is why I'm here. Yes, good. Okay, Mel, you're in the right place. Anybody else? So you're using that data, because I think we mustn't underestimate the power of data. And as I said in my introduction, this has been a journey for me. I'm learning about how we can use data better to not only improve our own decisions within the organisation, but also how to be more accountable to our beneficiaries, to our funders, to our stakeholders, and of course to our community. So Kerry says key data is often held by individual volunteers and cannot be usefully combined for any purpose. Great, because I know Liz is going to touch on that point a bit later. And Joe says our systems are very difficult to pull data from, so we're looking at new systems to improve that. Absolutely, this is a lot about systems, and Liz is going to touch on that as well. All right, so thank you for that, just getting you thinking about data and putting it in a kind of really usable analogy. Thanks, Liz.
Okay, excellent. All right, so we'll start off then with some, just really talk through some of those benefits. And I think some of this then to, who was it who was just saying about influencing internal stakeholders, Joe, hopefully some of this as well will help you to do that, because there are significant benefits in using data and the information that you hold. And I think what is just really good to acknowledge is that there are, most not-for-profits do hold huge amounts of data already. It's just that they're not actually harnessing it and using it for benefits. So you kind of may have one bit, but it's just then taking it to that next level and being able to actually use it for strategic reasons. So some of these benefits we'll talk through. So evaluation, and this isn't necessarily always just about kind of that formal program or project evaluation. I mean, it is, as in that's incredibly important as well, but this is also to enable really agile ways of working and essentially looking very quickly to say, right, this change or this initiative that we've just put forwards, actually that's making a big impact, and being able to recognize that quickly so you can either do more of it, or you know what, this just isn't working, or it's creating some kind of negative impact. so let's stop doing that as well, or let's change, let's pivot and do something different. So it's giving you that level of insight in a very agile way and very quick way, rather than having to spend, maybe doing some evaluation once a year, or or those evaluations going purely just to the executive level. It's actually being able to use your data to then operationally, from lots of different people within the organisation, to use that data to impact the work that they're doing. And that really moves into that second point around making more sound decisions. We all know that making decisions based on real evidence is going to be better. I mean, obviously we can use our own gut instinct, which is built up over an amount of time, but if you want to be able to demonstrate then the effectiveness of a particular program or a direction that you'd like to take, to be able to back that up is incredibly powerful to get that buy-in internally. You can become more innovative, and this again goes back to that agile way of working, because again you can test things and really quickly see, is that working? Let's try something new. Is it working? Is it not? And again, you can see very quickly what's going on in the organisation and whether it's creating positive results for you. Engaging and motivating your workforce, and I think this is really important in terms of, again, it's creating that evidence about what impact you're creating as an organisation and being able to demonstrate that without a huge amount of effort in kind of sifting through more qualitative types of data. There's smarter ways of doing it so that you can really see this is the impact that all this hard work is actually creating, and this is the value that we're bringing to the community. The other areas around inefficiencies, and this obviously is incredibly important to not-for-profits. We've got to really maximise every dollar of funding that we get, or sponsorship that you get, making sure then that it's bringing the maximum of value. And again, there may be things that are happening. I mean, we see a lot of duplication of either duplication of data collection or duplication in processes, or manual working through of data that's, for reporting, that days can be spent doing things where actually it can be done much more efficiently and quickly, so that you get the most kind of bang for your buck from your staff as well. So huge efficiencies can be created there. We've included this fraud and corruption because it's incredibly important, and I know it's a little bit more on the negative side, but it is important, and this comes down to that trust essentially from the community and from donors and other funders, to be able to say that you have got those robust internal control frameworks as well in place, essentially to ensure that that you've got the right governance in place, your data is being used appropriately and you're being managed appropriately. Not only your organisation, but any of your partners that you may work with, or service providers as well, to ensure then that is all of that use of quite often personal information and data from either customers or clients or members, that is being managed appropriately, because that really helps to maintain that trust and confidence of the community. The second to last point there, reporting on the value of your activities and telling better stories, that sort of ties into the engaging and motivating your workforce, but that's more from that external perspective as well, and that can really help to understand that where you're creating the value, so that you can either demonstrate that to your funders, and I think a lot of the funders, and we're seeing a lot more not-for-profits saying that they're becoming more pressured to demonstrate the value of the funding that they're getting, or the sponsorship that they may be getting from large corporates, for example, and being able to demonstrate that. And you can really pull together some really impactful, powerful stories through using the data that you're holding. And ultimately, all of this really does help to build that trust and the confidence in the organisation that, the funding, you're maximising the use of your funding, you're being highly effective and efficient, you're actually creating huge value and impact, and you're able to demonstrate that as well. Hopefully that gives you some good fodder there for any internal stakeholders if they're not sure about the value from the data that you've got.
Liz and Kerry has agreed that unfortunately fraud and corruption is a real risk in non-profit organisations, and I might include a link later in the chat box for everyone if they want to learn more about this. But it's just a sad reality that it does happen within the nonprofit sector. And so whilst there's all these really positive reasons why we should get better at using our data, there's reasons like fraud and corruption that actually means we should be as responsible leaders, and if we're governing our organisations, we should be making sure that we've got good data and we're using it to prevent those negative sides of people that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was really keen to talk with people about then all the types of data that you collect, and just to see if we could put this into a bit of a simple model here. And I'd really like if you could put in the chat whether you use some of this terminology, which is inputs, outputs and outcomes. Now, traditionally, so just feel free to put that in the chat so I can see if you use these words. Traditionally, we have used inputs and outputs, the data around that, very well. So inputs are all the things that we have coming into our organisation. Inputs are everything that it takes to run your organisation and to deliver your services or provide your products, whatever it is that you're doing. So inputs usually is your balance sheet, but it also can be human inputs as well. So it could be the amount of volunteers that you've got, or the kind of in-kind collaboration and resources that you have. So everything that you need to invest in your organisation. And then outputs generally talks about the activities or the services that you provide, the number of people that come through your organisation, maybe the number of students you have in your school, or the activities that you do to engage your beneficiaries. All of that, that's all of what you do, and it's quite quantifiable. So I typically say it's about numbers. And we're okay with that. We tend to be in the nonprofit sector pretty used to counting things and being able to report on what we do. It also should include who we reach though. Who are those beneficiaries of our organisation? But the data around outcomes is a little bit trickier. And that is what I think over the last 10 years we've been trying to get our heads around a lot better in this sector. So what kinds of data tells us what changes because of our activities? Who changes? What is the impact that we make because of our services and activities? And generally, we call this a theory of change. And theories of change are based on assumptions. So we're saying, if we do this, this will happen as a result. It's kind of what we think will happen. It's our desired theory of change until we can validate it, until we have the evidence to prove that if we run these activities or provide these services, this is what happens as a result. And this is a little bit trickier regarding data, because you can't always count things like quality of life, mental health, student engagement, all those wonderful things that really gives us a sense of purpose in our sector, in our organisation. So those things are a little bit trickier to catch. But we need to work out how that data tells us and validates whether our theory of change is correct. Now, we can do that in two ways. We can do it in a quantitative way, so we can collect sort of the results of surveys and things that we might do in a more of a numbers way. That's called quantitative or statistical way and statistical data. But we can very well do it through stories as well, and qualitative way. So we can actually go and do interviews and focus groups, and we can collect stories of change. We can even make videos and take photographs. All of those things, that is still data. That's all data, but it gives us the evidence that our theory of change is correct. So I just wanted to say, if we went back to this analogy of our organisation was a car, we have to work out what types of data do we need to fuel this sense of we know what we're doing, we know how well we're doing it, and we know what change is occurring. Now, the next slide that Liz is going to show is another great way of explaining the importance of data in terms of inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And it tells us that we don't want to know it just to no change. We want to be really convinced that what our work does is creating an impact. But we also really need to know from this data whether we're doing our work efficiently and effectively. Ultimately, we want to ask ourselves 3 questions. How much did we spend? How much did we do? And how much did it matter? Or in other words, is anyone better off? So collecting data about inputs is very important, but we have to make sure that we understand, was that input relative, or how was it relative to the outputs, and how was that relative to the outcomes? So all types of data is important, and we just have to sew the pieces together to make sure that we have an understanding about what we're doing and why. And of course, it could be very different for different regions, different programs, different parts of your organization. Not all inputs, outputs, and outcomes are the same. So that's where it gets a little bit more complex when we're actually drilling it right down and saying, okay, what would tell us about this program, whether we're being efficient and effective? Or what do we need as an organization to tell us we're being efficient and effective? I think what I want to say here, Liz, is just that I heard this a while ago and it really hit me. And somebody wrote this, so it wasn't from me, but I heard it, and someone said, data should be disruptive. And I thought, whoa, that's strong. But you know, it's really true. Data should be disruptive. It should challenge us. It should help us learn. It should help us reflect. And if it's not disrupting our thinking or making us really think, how could we improve that? How could we become more efficient? How could we create better outcomes for our beneficiaries? Then we're not really harnessing that data well enough.
Absolutely, Ruth. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. So I think we're going to go for a little bit of question time here, just to get some input again, get to make sure everyone's awake and not drifting off in any way. Ask you some questions. So so some of these key questions here really is looking at how are you using data, and just to give us a sense, because I think for the rest of the session we can slightly tailor what we're going to be telling you. So the first question is about what data does your organisation require to deliver on its objectives, and you can either put it into the chat box or just have a think about that. And really the second question is about, is all of this data collected? So first, is it collected? And I guess the second part of that, is it collected in a digital format as well, or is it?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important question today, Liz, because we know that data that's written down can be stored and get destroyed very quickly. It's not very safe if it's in paper form or if it's locked away in a cupboard. We can't really access that data very easily. So the reason why it's good to try and go digital is so that it's easily accessible, we can go back to it easily, we can store it efficiently, and it's just a lot more usable, I think, if we do look at ways that we can digitally collect that data and use it better. If you're collecting all sorts of different data and you're trying to understand what it all means, that's really difficult, and it may not be very useful if you're trying to do that, or you may just not bother at all because it's just too much hard work. So I think that that's a really important point, that we have to understand and get some collective decisions across the organisation about what kind of data is important, what kind of data do we need to collect, and then how do we use that. Liz, we've got Nell, who says we currently got no databases and our process is very ad hoc. Yep, how we collect it. So again, that's a really good point, that we need to think again about how it's a bit like a journey or a map, I suppose, of the different types of data that we collect. And again, what I said, qualitative and quantitative are equally important depending on what it is that you're trying to collect and how you're going to use it.
I can see there, oh, who's that? So it's just moved down. Michaela talking about you are capturing quite a lot of data, but you're getting better at measuring then the social impacts and social returns, because they're key organisational objectives, which is fantastic to hear. So that's really good.
Hodgepodge, Joe says. It's a hodgepodge. I'm sure you're not alone, Joe. I think that also the older your organisation, the more hodgepodge you might actually find your systems in, because every new leader or CEO comes in and says, oh, we need a way of collecting that, or, you know, and new systems come on the market all the time. Liz, I'm sure you're across all of this.
Yeah.
You know, the technology that we have today, even 5-10 years ago, we wouldn't have dreamt of having some of the technology, you know, that we've got. So I think as new things come on the market, and as we find that there's new need for collecting data, that means that we start using all different systems. So it's not wrong particularly, but we do have to be aware that that can cause us problems and challenges.
There's a big difference here, and Brian here says, hi Brian. Data that they require is diverse, so very much sort of both the strategic and operational. So strategic, are you making an impact as a service organisation? And then being able to then pull it down to that operational level also, so that program efficiency and effectiveness. So that's kind of, again, looking at that ability to use data at all different levels of an organisation. It doesn't necessarily just need to be held in your board reports that get presented by executives to your boards or whatever, or strategic kind of committees, to be able to use that data to impact what people are doing as well at the program level. Right.
I think, Liz, you should share your slide about opportunities now, because this is great. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. And it feels good, I think, that sometimes organisations across the sector are in a similar boat, and we all share some of these common challenges.
That's right, and you'll definitely see some of these as very familiar then, I think, probably reflecting some of the comments coming through in the chat box. So this slide is it's really taken from some of the work that we've done in the not-for-profit space, and these are just some of the challenges, but I'd say probably some of the key ones, and again I think you'll recognise some of these challenges, but also then it just starts to talk through some of those key opportunities as well in turning some of those challenges around and actually using your data for good and for value. So, so this particular client that we worked with, you know, they had very inefficient forms of capturing some of the data that they needed within the organisation that they were reporting against. So as some of you have talked about here, there's a real mix of information being held within systems, and so it is digital, which is good, and that's certainly one step. But a lot of the really key information was actually still being written down on paper forms and being then filed away, which, as we've talked about, is just makes it really difficult then to analyse and use that for additional purposes. And it tends just to get locked away in a drawer and kind of forgotten about, or it's incredibly manual to go through and be reading it all and trying to pull out some of those really key nuggets and insights within it. So they had that real mix. Where they did then have data being held digitally, it was very much in siloed, kind of disparate systems, which didn't talk to each other. And this is a huge issue. I think a lot of organisations are dealing with it, not just in the not-for-profit space, but certainly within health as well, where fantastic tools have been introduced to deal with a particular problem or to, you know, use a particular data set. But actually they don't talk, and really the value in being able to bring multiple data sets or pieces of information together is that the insight can be massively magnified where you're putting multiple bits of information together. They can just create a much more rich story about what's happening within the organisation or with your clients or customers, whatever you call them. This organisation as well had really low, and they did recognise it, they had low maturity in the way that they managed information and data. So, you know, it was a big journey for them to be able to then upskill their staff and to introduce appropriate ways of managing that data and really maximising the use of it. So starting from a low maturity there, they were very limited in the way that they were able to quickly harness the data and use it for information and decision making. And some of that goes back to, you know, it took days or even weeks to pull some reports together. You know, very manual, a lot of kind of pulling data from multiple different databases or systems, putting it into Excel, you know, trying to create value that way, but it very, very inefficient. And usually by the time these reports are then pulled together, things have moved on anyway and things have changed potentially. So wasn't particularly efficient. And the last point is, again, is really, we're seeing this more and more, just people recognizing that huge cultural shift that will be required within their organization to really use their data to its maximum value. And again, that goes back to that low maturity in the way that they're managing data, but often it's just not even some key people within the organization not understanding the potential benefits that are there. So that's sort of the first step, driving that understanding that there are huge values possible.
Yeah, Liz, I just want to say I have a story about an organisation that was taking 2 days to run a report every month of something particular that they were capturing. And the thing is that they didn't even know that there was a quicker way of doing this. But once they got someone who could do a few macros and could actually automate it, and it took them a couple of days, but once that was done, it took 10 minutes. And they were all just blown away. The fact that what had been taking them 2 days a month now took 10 minutes. And so I think it's about people within organisations looking for opportunities to get more efficient with their data reporting and collection. And that is a cultural shift. You know, people have to say, is there a better way of doing this? And once they find that there is potentially a better way of doing it, wow, you know, it can just be amazing for staff to realise that.
In fact, that's right, exactly. So, you know, the lines at the bottom there talk about some of the opportunities. So for this organisation, you know, there were huge opportunities for them in increasing the efficiency of the organisation and the way that they were working. Again, you know, it was due to that they weren't able to share information easily, so there was a lot of duplication happening in collecting or in trying to analyse information and data, and not understanding then conversations that might have happened with a client or, you know, a member or a donor. So there wasn't that sort of that journey of your story with that particular person, that individual as well. So so that operational efficiencies, huge benefit there that they could really grasp. And then the effective use of data for decision making, to be able to actually use it. I think at the time when we started first talking with them, you know, they had very low use of data when they were making decisions. And as I said, it was more from a kind of a reporting, maybe a bit of compliance, that kind of approach where they did their reports to the board. But I think it wasn't that real sort of, you know, real-time, agile understanding of what's happening within the business so that they could make decisions and change courses of action if they needed to based on the data that they had. And then, you know, a big one is then just the way that you then engage with your clients or your members or whoever it is that you are serving, your communities. Because again, if you understand about them, you have that history, if you can understand what it is that they want better or what sort of needs are that they have, that you can then change your services very quickly in order to adapt to that. So it might be that maybe you understand then better about what are the demographics in your area, or what are the changing socioeconomic conditions in your area. So where you're able to then leverage other external pieces of data, so not even just your own data, and then overlay that with the data that you have yourself, it just potentially could tell a slightly different story that you can then be able to adapt your services to really harness that.
Yeah, Liz, I think we have a very typical reaction to saying to someone we're going to collect some data. People go, oh no, you know, because I think that we have a history of saying data collection is all about compliance and it takes us away from what we really want to do. And unfortunately, that has created a culture within the sector, which means that we don't even embrace the idea of, you know, collecting data. We see it as a burden, particularly on our service delivery staff. And so I think that's a really important thing that we need to do within our organisations, is think about how do people feel when they're collecting data? Do they see it as an exciting opportunity to learn more about what they're doing and the impact they're making? Or are they feeling it's all just about compliance and top down, you know, we've got to do this, and they never see that data again. So it's just, you know, it means nothing to them. So it's a really big topic, I think, to talk about within organisations and create that culture shift.
Exactly, that's right. It does. It is a big shift, but I think, as you say, if people understand the benefit to them personally, it starts to help them change the way that they see about collecting data and doing things with data. And, you know, because it goes down as well as how good a quality is your data, and that takes everyone. So everybody collecting information, you know, if they know, actually, if they fill in all these boxes, there's a huge benefit to doing that, because actually we're going to get X, Y, and Z result out of that, as opposed to, oh, this is just another burden, I have to do this. So it's that personal impact as well is helpful. Yeah. I'll move on here. So just give you a sense of, this isn't everything in terms of data management, but I just wanted to put some of the key points to say sort of what does good data management look like. And it really is looking at that entire life cycle. We call it life cycle of data. So it's right from the beginning of that collection point, you know, how you store it, how you use it, how you maybe share it, whether that's internally or even with partners or kind of, you know, service providers you might work with. And then how you archive it once it's maybe not so needed at that point, and then how you destroy it as well. So there is a real life cycle around that, which I'm sure if you Google, you know, data life cycle, you can also find online.
Data supply chains, are they using that a bit more?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. There's different words for it, but it's essentially, it's looking at, there's an appropriate use of data across all of that different life cycle. So it's just making sure that you've got the right processes in place and the right tools to manage that, and the right skills in the organisation as well to maximise use of that. Establishing authoritative sources of data. So I think someone may have mentioned earlier in the chat box about this sort of thing like a source of truth, and that's basically this. It's about saying the data that you're using, we call it authoritative, so it's basically, it's trusted, it's well governed, so the right people are able to make the right decisions regarding that data. So that just means then that when you're pulling that and using that to pull reports, for example, there's not a real concern about the quality or, you know, where's that information coming from, that people trust it, so that's, because that's often the problem as well. You might have great systems in place, pull fantastic reports, and then people don't actually trust the data and don't want to then use that data for decision making. Access to timely data, that's just another thing, is again, it's going back to how long is it taking for that data to, you know, be pulled into reports and to be analysed and to then to be presented. Because if it's, you know, 2-3 weeks old, then again, you sort of lose a little bit of that trust, depending on how agile and how quickly things move. You might be actually just losing information that you could be presented with if it's quicker. And then a more consistent approach to managing your data. So again, it's just putting in those policies and those rules and the way that you use and sort of manage your data so that it's consistent, and everybody knows what, for example, might be the sort of minimum data sets that you might need to collect. And everybody across that organisation knows, like going back to that, you know, oh, why am I having to write in this data in this particular data field? If people understand why, because that gives you then the benefit, it's just creating that consistency, and again that helps with then reporting and using that information for.
Yeah, and I wonder, Liz, who online has a policy around ethical collection of data? Does anybody consider your ethics? As a researcher, I live and breathe, you know, have I collected this data ethically? Have I got consent from people? Am I sharing photos or stories online that I've got consent to share? And I think it's something that maybe some organisations overlook a little bit. And it's so incredibly important with things like social media these days, when, you know, once you've sent out a story or a photo or a report, it's out there. You can't sort of pull it back. So I think that if everybody can make sure that you've got some form of policy or some principles that people understand in your organisation around the ethics of collecting data and then how you use that data.
That's right, absolutely. And data ethics, I mean, we're actually doing a lot in that space now. It's starting to become better known and understood, and helping organisations to ensure that they are managing their data ethically, and because that goes back into that trust and that community trust with what you're doing. But it is quite a big area to access the guide.
Yeah, Rowan has just asked if there is a guide, and you will be able to find some things on the internet. I particularly use, and in my course I've got there's a real public one around children and how you collect information from children and the ethical principles. It's been developed, I think, I can't remember the organisation, but it's a really standard set of principles that you should be adopting as an organisation if you work with children or collect data from children. So have a Google, or let me know if you need any tips on that.
We can send some links maybe when we, after this, actually we've got some details as well. I better just move on, I'm mindful of time.
Yeah, we're 1:45, so.
Okay, so this, so what I wanted to show you here, this is about, and again this is taken from an actual example of a client that we've done some work with, and this kind of shows you that sort of end-to-end structure for really being able to then get use from your data and getting that maximum use and that agile approach and the insights that you can drive. So if you look on the left hand side there, so that's all of your data sources, and so this might cover, you know, your clients' inquiries, that might be emails coming in, or it might even be on the phone, people phoning in. So you want to be able to capture all of this information. You've got donor information, you might be giving out grants, and so you've got grant recipient information as well. You might obviously have your finance and HR data as well. You might have a load of volunteers that work for you, so you need to be able to capture information about them. And also your website and social media, that kind of digital insights as well that you're getting through there. So there's, and there's loads more, obviously loads more sources as well, but these are just some of the key ones for this particular client. Now some of the data for them was being collected in a paper format. As I said, this is kind of going back to one of the conversations we had earlier. In a paper format, which just meant that it was very, very difficult for that to really be kind of analysed and to be used more broadly. So one of the key things for them was to be able to get rid of some of that paper. You can never go completely paperless. I think it's very difficult to do that, but as much as possible, that's one of those key things. Make sure that you're capturing information as much as possible in a digital format. And there's so many quite easy ways and not expensive ways now of doing that. So, you know, web forms, so there may be a plug-in to your website even that you can capture information through a form. Obviously you've got CRMs and different mechanisms for then, if people are phoning up, that if you've got people on the end of the phone, that they can be putting in records of that conversation, at least online, so that you've got some record of it digitally. So that as much as possible, that's one of those key things. Make sure that your data is being collected in a digital format. And then I'll skip to the end. So the other side of this is the benefits. And that's really for each of those different kind of personas, as it were. So you've got either your clients or your members, you've got your frontline workers, then you've got your more management level, your kind of executives, and people in the back office, your more administrative function. And each of those should be able to use the data that you're collecting to get some value from it as well. So looking at, say, for example, your frontline workers, for them to be able to have access to more data about potentially about those clients, that will help them to provide a better service for the clients and a better experience for the clients, because they have that record of interactions that they may have had or what their history is there, and they have a real full picture of that. They might also then have some of those stories as well that we've talked about before, which kind of demonstrate the impact and the value that they're creating. So it might be your frontline workers are, out trying to encourage more funding and more donors and sponsorship, things like that. And again, that they've got access to those kind of stories and that information of the value that is being created. Your executives, of course, you're more into that kind of operational type data, but to be able to then use that information, as we've talked about previously, to really base quite important strategic decisions on. Or it might be about looking at, as I said, sort of tweaking the way that you're working in quite an agile way so that we can get the most out of the funding that you're getting, so that you can drive as much value as you can. And then again, your back office workers, in terms of being able to, again, they have access to that data as well, where they can make decisions on an everyday basis, again, to help to improve the way that they're working, to cut down on the time for reports. I think that's probably one of the key things that we hear about, is just the time it takes to develop reports that are for, as I said, boards or kind of executives, to really drive efficiencies there in the use of the resources that you've got.
And the only thing I want to add there, Liz, is that I think one of the benefits is to actual and innovation. Collecting data about what you do, why you do it, what's feedback from your beneficiaries and your donors, for example, it really allows you to say, wow, what opportunity or what can we do differently and innovatively? So I know right now a lot of you are doing your services and service delivery differently because of COVID-19. And because you're collecting some data about how that's working, it allows you to go, well, actually, in the future, how could we provide services differently? So it's based on the information that you're gathering and how you're using that information to decide whether you can be more innovative.
That's right. And just in terms of then the sort of the how in this, so for this example, and there's different ways of doing it, and it does depend on what you're trying to achieve and what data you're collecting, etc. But in this scenario, it's looking at then pulling that data out of those source systems and pulling them into, we did it for a data warehouse in this example, and you may have heard that term, and more it's becoming more common, and using different sort of warehouse, usually cloud-based, is becoming more and more popular at the moment. And you might have heard of solutions like Azure or Amazon Web Services, and so we don't recommend one over the other, but certainly there's ways of then pulling out the key piece of information so that it's held in a form that is stored effectively. You can then start to really use it to analyze and pull reports out of it. So in that insights bit there, it talks about a customer dashboard or an operational dashboard. And so it's just a really easy way of harnessing that data that you've got in all those different disparate systems, putting it together, and then being able to draw out of that those views. It's that visualization of that data that's really important, because again, you can have huge amounts of data, but unless you can really visualize it and use it in a practical way to make decisions, it's very difficult then to drive the value from it. But it's becoming much more common and less expensive. These cloud-based solutions are actually not that expensive anymore to store that data and to essentially analyze it and run sort of queries from it. There's things you do need to watch out for, because one of the key things is knowing what it is that you want to, what data do you need to answer the questions that you need as an organization to help you. So you don't want to just stick everything into your data warehouse, because then the hosting costs do go up. And likewise, if you have huge amounts of data in there that you don't necessarily need, it costs more per query to run those reports. So there's a little bit of kind of knowledge needed in setting that up, but if it's done well, it doesn't need to cost a huge amount of money, which is obviously of incredible importance to non-profits. But the value, though, that you can get from being able to then use that data in that way is it could be.
I think that's why people love infographics, isn't it, Liz? I love infographics because, again, I don't want to see loads of writing and text and numbers. Even though I'm a researcher, I still love a few infographics to make it really easy to see what we're talking about. And many non-profits are actually doing their whole annual reports based on infographics these days. making it really easy for people to see. Yeah.
But the challenge with that is often they're being done manually, so it takes a long time. The beauty of this sort of a solution when you've got this set up is those dashboards are pretty much real time, and they're able to do it, you know, within sort of seconds or, you know, if not minutes, but very, very quickly. And you can set it up so that different people have different views. So your executive may need a different view and a different dashboard to your frontline workers or your back office staff, your finance staff, for example. So, but it's just, it pulls out the key piece of information for you to be able to make the decisions that you need. So it's really, really powerful.
I think Kerry has actually come up with the next webinar, and it's all about how you actually analyse the data and how you actually make sense of it, because you're right, Kerry, you can collect all this information, but it's really your perspective and on the conclusions that you draw. So you do have to be careful about analysis and whose perspective is it that's saying, oh, well, this means we're doing really well, or this means we're not doing really well, like, you know. So yeah, I think Kerry's come up with the great next webinar.
Very true. So in terms of then some of those key points and some of those key kind of takeaways, as it were, some tips. So I mentioned it in the last slide, understand what are the questions that you need to answer. So it's just really important, because if you know that, then you can start to work backwards from there. Because again, you might be actually collecting huge amounts of information and data that actually you don't necessarily need. So it's focusing on collecting and then measuring what you should and not what you can as well. So I think a lot of people start to get into that kind of analysis paralysis, where there's all this amazing data suddenly if it's all being held digitally, but you spend a lot of time then creating reports that are actually not adding that much value. So really understanding what are those strategic questions or operational questions you need to answer. Understand your data sources. But we actually spend a fair bit of time with organisations, not just not-for-profits, but actually helping them to understand what have they got, what have they already got, what data have they got, what tools and systems are they using across an organisation, and just kind of putting that into a bit of a structure and some sort of order. I had to mention there, digitised paper forms. Please, 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 if you're still collecting data in handwritten forms, please try to digitise that as much as you possibly can. Ensuring consistency in data collection to maintain trust. We've talked a bit about this, but again, it's just that because once you start to try to analyse it, if your data is inconsistent, if there's duplicate results, if there's gaps missing, you know, it just makes it very difficult to really trust the insights that you'd hope to glean from it. Select a data visualization tool. Going back to that last point, it just makes it so much easier to help to communicate what data is telling you and to understand it so that you can do something with it. And that goes into that data analysis with actionable insights. So that's again about just making sure that you're using it to improve business decisions, and it's not just getting into that kind of looking at kind of going down into a black hole of analysis. And the last point is about that cultural change, which is important, and it's starting to put it in at all levels of the organisation, help people to understand the value of what the data that they are collecting, set some kind of key performance indicators, and this is just might be very simple about you need to collect this, this, this and this, and this is why. So that real kind of what's that minimum data set, or what do you need to do with that data to make sure that it can be maintained in an appropriate way. So start putting that into people's kind of key performance indicators, KPIs, and understand that they know what is expected of them in that use of the data as well. So that's some key things there.
Hopefully today you felt that you've been jogged about some thoughts, or you've got something to go away and have a look for or look at. Or of course you can contact us if you've got any questions, particularly Liz, because she's the expert in this area. But we really hope that you've taken away some ideas today around you know, knowing that data is a valuable asset to your organisation, so it should be treated as such, carefully thought about and having a good strategy for. You know, making sure that everybody in your organisation understands the role that they play in looking and capturing and analysing data. Really thinking about how data management plays a role in being accountable to your beneficiaries and your funders. So it's not just about compliance. We still do need to comply with all the laws and your funding agreements, but above that, it's about learning and improving your organization and how it makes impact. So have a good, clear strategy. Think about what you need to collect. Don't collect anything you don't need to. That's actually unethical. Don't go and do too much. Don't bombard people with data collection needs, you know, and say you've got to collect all of this if you're not going to use it well. In fact, many of you may need to actually stop collecting some data because you're just not using it well. So is that a good way to end, do you think, Liz, today?
I think we've done. I don't know if there's any final questions from anyone before we finish, but no, we're pretty much out of time, I think. But honestly, if anyone has got any questions, let me go to this slide. Our email addresses are there. Have a look at the GWI website as well, or Ruth, your website as well, and our LinkedIn page. There's information there as well. We've got some of our kind of, oh, well done. There's some, and we'll send actually, why don't we send a few links as well. All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much. Happy to, for anyone to reach out, and we'll send through the slide pack as well so you've got it. But thanks everyone. Have a fantastic day.